Okay, we are alive. Apparently not. Hang on.
Hi, I'm Hatman. I'm pretty sure that I have a head cold.
Why am I? No, like this. No, that's not how I want. No, go back. I'm apparently not intelligent enough to run this system. There we go. Are we on? Are we on now? Can people see us? Excellent.
Cool.
Okay, welcome back. I am Daedalus Media, and we are back for night 2 of our discussion of genocide. You have your show notes open.
Yeah, I got him.
We are talking this evening about examples of genocides for some time. Where did I put my show notes? Here they are.
So, I don't know if we should start with the Shoah or Poriyamos. Poriyamos is what the Roma, some people might call them gypsies, which is a prerogative term, but I don't know if we should start with that because we covered it quite extensively yesterday in terms of the Showa being sort of this archetype, for uh, well, not the only one, but it being a major factor in sort of in influencing the Article 2 and 3 of the Genocide Convention.
Which one then would you like to start with?
So sad to say, I'm not an expert on Armenia, and it's not something I am well versed in, even though I really should be. I think we should maybe talk about. We might want to go outside of this show notes a bit and focus on the 1990s and specifically the Rwandan and Bosnian cases. I also think maybe we could talk about uh, Cambodia as well,
Yeah, it's in the
because
notes.
even though the Cambodian genocide, or really like, when you refer to it, you're referring sort of to the collective reign of terror of the Khmer Rouge, um, the Red Khmer government led by Pol Pot and his followers. Um, there is a very clear cut genocidal event within it, but there's also some caveats.
So let's
How
start
do you
with
want to start this?
Rwanda.
So Rwanda, I would say, is probably next to the Nazi Holocaust, one of the most clearly defined cases of genocide in modern history. It's definitely all of the almost every category within Article 2 is met, and intent is very, very clear with it. Um, to give a little bit of a background about Rwanda, so Rwanda has, of course, colonial history with the French. There are two major, or actually three ethnic groups, but two major ones in the country. The group that is the majority in Rwanda is the ethnic group called the Hutu, and the minority group is the Tutsi. And during colonial times, Europeans favored the Tutsi over the Hutu. There is also less widely known a example of mass violence by a Tutsi government in Rwanda, and I think it was 1975, where around 50 to 100,000 Hutu were massacred in acts of pogroms and ethnic violence. And so this is a factor that actually isn't widely talked about. This there are historical, uh, there's a definite historical tension between these two groups, and the Rwandan genocide happens sort of, not sort of, but during a civil war where you have the Rwandan Patriotic Front led by Paul Kagame, who is still the president of Rwanda after actually he was able to depose uh, the Hutu genocidal government, but he's never. I mean, this is what 1993, 94. So he's still president to this day, and I don't think there's going to be any other presidents in Rwanda. But that aside,
I hear he has a
this
shockingly high approval rating.
this happens, you know, during a civil war, and particularly during a time where there's, some military and militant groups are trying to vie for power, and the Rwandan genocide is something that, like all genocides, it has a gradual, we were talking about the 10 stages, so it has, a buildup, and one of the most, I think, insidious aspects of it, and you see this in other genocides, but you see this particularly with Rwanda. We'll talk more about the Bosnian War, but you specifically use of mass media, radio, television, where you have these uh, Hutu extremist people that they're allied with the government, and they're essentially um, broadcasting, from the cities to even villages, urging,
People to be
uh,
killed.
yeah, urging people to be killed. And the killing in this particular genocide is overwhelmingly not done with like guns. It's done at a very intimate level with machetes. And actually, one of the during when they had the trials, the International ICTYR, I think, so the International Criminal Court in Rwanda, they're able to trace back um, all of sort of the orders of tens of thousands, maybe over 100,000 machetes from the West, from I think the United States and other countries. So this was planned. It was something that wasn't spontaneous, even though the killings, they don't occur. The killings bear a lot of hallmarks of pogroms, or like in Russian, pogromy, or pogromy in Ukrainian. So the violence is very, there's an extreme amount of violence, but it's not something that's extremely well orchestrated. You have mobs of people carrying it out, and you have a group. Um, I forget if they were. I know that they were an official, you know, sanctioned group by the Hutu military government called the Interahamwe, which go around uh, committing these murders, these mass murders, and the violence is very intimate. It's neighbor killing neighbor. Sometimes it is even husband killing wife, or vice versa. Uh, this was the level to which people, they inspired this hatred in people. There's a very good um, film about the Rwandan genocide called Sometimes in April. It actually has, I think, who was, there's talk of him being the next James Bond, and everyone got
Idris Elba.
upset. Yeah, Idris Elba stars in it. It's a very, very uh, accurate film. There's also another film, Hotel Rwanda. The thing about the Rwandan genocide is it took place under watch, with a small UN, but they were really rendered powerless. And the head of the Romeo Dallaire, Canadian general, and I think most of his unit there was actually there were
Pull,
Belgians.
pull your
But
microphone
this
a little
this
closer. You're
occurred,
cutting out.
as far as I know, this occurred in the wake of the Black Hawk Down affair. It occurred in the wake of the Somalia intervention, which was very. I think you can explain a little bit about this aspect about it.
I can talk about the battles pretty well. Pull your microphone a little closer. You keep cutting out.
Okay.
So,
So, I mean, less about the battles, but more about what this
yes.
did. You know,
So Somalia had descended into a civil war prior to the 94 Rwandan genocide. In 1993, um, oh, one of the former congressmen formed a militia of Somalia, and in 1993 he attacked members of the UNISOM group trying to provide aid to the United Nations group, trying to provide aid to the Somali people, food aid. And Adid's militia tries to take control of the food supply as a method of putting pressure on the people to allow him to take power in the capital of Mogadishu of Somalia. He makes a number of attacks against the United Nations. The United States sends in military forces to try to capture Adid. And what occurs is a 4-month long series of running battles, which culminate in the Battle of Mogadishu uh, in October of 93. Yeah, that is October, isn't it? I think so. Hang
yeah, I
on.
believe so.
Battle of Mogadishu. Yes, October 3 and 4 of 1993. Thanks, Cal. I've noticed. Uh, which which is famously depicted in the movie Black Hawk Down and the novel, which I don't know, but probably people have read at this point. At any rate, the warlords take out a pair of Black Hawk helicopters, and the entire 15-minute operation ends up taking 2 days. So the United States was very much soured on the prospect of sending troops into Africa after that.
I think in many cases, it affected it. It certainly created problems. In the Bosnia intervention, particularly in regards to the Dutch contingent that was present in Srebrenica, which we'll talk about later. Um, yeah, but particularly with Rwanda, the Rwanda comes in the shadow of this very tragic event.
You're talking
One thing,
October to April. Uh,
yeah,
it's not that long, honestly.
the Rwanda genocide or the Somalian?
The Rwanda genocide is not that long after the Battle of Mogadishu, so it's
No,
it's
it's
an
not.
incredibly
It's
fresh
it's
memory for
3 months, I
everyone.
believe.
At the same time, it's kind of hard.
It's extremely fresh, and you know, there are people on the ground in Somalia, witnesses to it, missionaries, certain State Department people who are actually begging the Clinton administration to intervene. And there's a lot of debate over, it wouldn't have taken much to stop it at least. And by the time it was over, you had 600,000 to over 1 million people dead, 1 million Tutsis. Uh, it also led, the results of it had ripple effects because when the Paul Kagame and did the Rwandan Patriotic Front, his army essentially intervened. They broke the ceasefire because their people were getting killed. When they marched all the way to Kagale, I think it is the capital. Am I right?
Yes,
Let's see.
I don't know the pronunciation, but that sounds right.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, by the time that they got there, uh, they deposed the government that was in power, and that created a bunch of people fleeing. So Hutus that were involved in the killings or people sort of tied to it. And that actually was a catalyst for the second Congolese civil war, which was one of the bloodiest conflicts and lesser known conflicts in human history, I think. Certainly one of the bloodiest in the 20th century and 21st century so far.
Yeah. So this ended July of 94, right? Or at least was ended by July of 94.
Yeah,
So you're talking a period about 3 months,
yeah, where the killings take place.
give or take. And you're talking anywhere between 500,000 and a million people dead. Is that in your, based on what you have seen, longer or shorter for most periods?
Of genocides.
Yes.
So,
Because I think the common thought is that there's kind of a very slow burn and then a very long period of violence.
I mean, that's, you got to remember that, for example, with the Holocaust, you have a very large portion of it carried out. So, like, I mean, the Holocaust by bullets. So, for those who don't know what that is the Holocaust, which German mobile units of, they call them collectively Einsatzgruppen, but they're the SS, SD units, various units of military police and such. But they carry out these very large massacres of Jews, you know, in the space really of about from, the summer of 1941 to spring of 1942. They kill about 1 point, I think more than that actually. That 1.2 million is about the estimate for Ukraine alone. So around 3 million people are killed. Um, that is almost half the number of the entire Holocaust.
Well,
Well, the entire Shoah,
yes.
Holocaust in Jewry.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, this takes place in a remarkably short period of time. Some of the largest massacres, Babin Yar occurred, I think. Let's see, I believe it occurred in September 1941, and the process of ghettoization of Jews in Kiev. So here's something that actually I want to add. In regards to the German, in regards to the in the Soviet Union. So one thing that the Germans did, a lot of people, I've been on many different forums, and someone will post something of like, say the Lviv pogroms or like, um, the Babin Yar mass shooting, or many of the other smaller mass shootings which occurred in various localities throughout Belarus, Ukraine, and the Baltics. And in the Ukrainian case, and in a lot of the cases, pretty much all of them, I hear the argument is, the Germans wouldn't have known who the Jews were in a certain locality had it not been for the neighbors. And while, there's a huge factor of denunciation in all of Europe, I'm including Western European countries and also, Poland, Eastern Europe. But when the Germans went into a village or a town, immediately what they did, at threat of death, if you did not show up there and you were caught without documentation that they would give to you, you were at risk of being arrested and shot on sight. So they carried out a tally of the population. And in some of these localities, you know, you have already people with their Soviet passports, they have their nationality. Also, um, some Jews in, of the Jewish population in Ukraine, they didn't flee the Germans, and they did this willingly because they remembered the Germans in 1918. And particularly during this period, the German occupation of Ukraine of 1918 was the most peaceful time of that very, very bloody era of the civil wars. And they also don't have a lot of love towards the Stalinist regime. They suffered like every other group in the Soviet Union, sometimes worse, particularly because of their religion being dismantled and different political groups like Zionists being targeted. So a lot of them, like the rest of the population, were cautiously optimistic. They
You're
didn't
cutting out.
believe. Oh, sorry. And where did I leave off?
A lot of them were cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, a lot of them were cautiously optimistic about the arrival. So I just wanted to, what my point is that you know people weren't, denunciation was huge, and it's huge in any genocide. Actually, it's something, there are always rescuers. There are always people who have a motivation to help others. Sometimes rescuers can be perpetrators too. By the way, they might rescue someone they know who they like and be involved in killing others of that group. That happens a lot as well. So that's one other important thing to mention about genocides is that perpetration is a very broad spectrum. Uh, Being a bystander's a very broad spectrum as well. A lot of times you don't have the luxury of being anything else. Uh, anyway.
So we kind of moved off topic a little bit. I want to run back to Rwanda, to a kind of important thing to talk about, I think.
Absolutely. And I'm sorry for getting off topic, but
No, it's all right.
this also covers a little bit of what we had planned to do. And I think it's something that is a feature in all of these different events.
The,
But go ahead.
the, the thing that I find really interesting about this, uh, the methodology of this genocide, the preparation, is this use of mass media
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
to direct violence. Because if
Yeah.
you listen to it, it has all of the characteristics of stochastic terrorism,
Yeah.
in a very real sense, and it also is a feature, I think, of things that we are seeing today here in the United States, of
More so now than in
media,
the past,
yes,
for sure.
media directed violence, stochastic
Yeah.
directed violence towards groups. Um, this kind of component, and anchoring it in history, I think, is important to understand that it is a thing. Um, it's controversial to talk about because it's politically charged, because the people who are doing it are politically motivated. But it is definitely a thing that is happening. And we're taking this for later, and I'm putting it in my box for when I talk about the thing I want to talk about at the end. I also, before we move on, I have a question that someone gave me from last night for you.
Okay.
The professor, I'm going to spell this name. I'm not going to pronounce it properly. Is the professor who was your advisor UNGVA with a little weird thing over it, RY?
Ungvari?
That might be it. Yes.
Holy crap, Ungvari. He is not. He is not my advisor. I am very much familiar with Ungvari's work. Um, my advisor I had two. So one of them is Hiroaki Kuramiya. He is a specialist mainly on uh, Stalinist era Soviet Union, particularly the Stalinist period in Ukraine. He's written books on Donbass, particularly he's a historian of the Donbass region of Ukraine that is so prominently featured in in the news today. But yeah, Christian Ungvari is I don't know. So my other advisor, so he is Laszlo Borhi, and him and Ungvari are acquaintances. I mean, they're not big fans of each other. Let's just say this. And I don't want
People
to
in the
call.
historian field not liking one another?
Yeah, but there's a little bit, and I think it's, to be fair, and I'm not gonna like, criticize my great, really a great advisor, really a great teacher. But them two have a very contentious relationship, and what I can say about Ungvari is he's a very good historian. I think that he is a bit apologetic when it comes to the Wehrmacht, and he tries to use the example to as a counterweight by saying, the Hanva didn't have sort of these ideological convictions of, anti-Slavic racism. Look, in the Hanved, you had a very contingent of minority soldiers, many of whom were Ruthenians, so Ukrainians from the Zakarpattia region of Ukraine. But he lacks a lot of nuance, at least in my experience, and he doesn't really approach the subject, in you know, as Hungarian involvement in these crimes as sort of part of a joint criminal enterprise. The Germans used the Hungarian rear area forces largely because they didn't have enough manpower to commit to the anti-partisan war. And these were very troops that were very poorly provisioned, much less so even than the Russians in Ukraine today. And a lot of the results are similar. And you see a lot of random acts of violence, and you also see organized acts of violence. But usually, in my own experience and my own research, they are closely coordinating their operations with the Wehrmacht and with German punitive organs. But anyway, that's besides the point. We can talk about my own research some other time. Regarding media, um, this happens too, specifically with radio stations in the Bosnian case as well.
Let's
And I'm
segue
not
on to
talking
Bosnia
about
too.
Srebrenica. Yeah, I'm not talking about the Srebrenica massacre. I'm talking about, during the course of the so-called Bosnian Civil War. You have Serb uh, radio stations basically kind of rehashing old wounds that, and this is happening in Rwanda too. They're bringing up, the example of the genocidal events that occurred to them during the Second World War, particularly at the hands of the Croatian puppet government, the Ustasha, which, the Bosniak groups, there were many of them who participated in the Ustasha movement as well. But they used this in a, of course, for their own means, and very, very nefarious means at that. But anyway, so yeah, this is a fixture that you see in modern genocide. Um, it existed too, of course, in the time of Nazi Germany. Um, it exists in really wherever genocide manifests itself, but you see it more. These the TVs, radio stations doing it more when they are more widespread. And with Rwanda, it's particularly insightful to violence.
Yes, this inciting to violence and this sort of being able to wash your hands of it is a thing that we see remarkably often today. Like, for example, the New Zealand Christchurch shooting,
Yeah,
or the recent case just down here in Colorado. The name of the club escapes me, but the case of that club, we have
yes,
we have
and you're seeing it through internet forms now.
it's
And I'm
it's very
wondering,
much this has been something I have been working on as part of the video essay series I'm doing here. But it's very much kind of like almost like you have a person who is a glass and you get drip, 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 drip of hate from all these different sources. And it's impossible to tell which drip makes the cup overflow and the action occur.
of course,
So you don't have something you don't really have in the already kind of murky land of holding people accountable for hate speech. You don't have a direct finger to point to say you are directly responsible for inciting this violence. It's very much this idea of a mass flood of coordinated messaging to cause violence.
I would say, in the case of, you know, of recent cases, in our country, um, it lacks the overall. I mean, there is, you could argue, of course, with the rhetoric, say, from, the Trump administration, or, something like this, that, that rhetoric led to, people to commit, um, violence, say, against the Asian minorities in the United States, or against trans people, or things along this line. But
There
what
are
you see is sort of a hand in hand relationship in the
I
case of Rwanda, and with the Bosnian case.
yes, I think so. Not every case is going to be like not every case of stochastic terror is going to be directed into a genocide.
No, no,
The
no.
reason I bring this up, though, and as we keep moving through these examples, kind of building my case here, is that it goes hand in hand with other things. Like we had those 10 steps. And that I kind of wanted to bring up yesterday, or I did bring up yesterday, but thought it was important, is it's like your little grab bag of tools to build the genocide is in that 10 steps, and you see different elements of those things come out. So not necessarily everything out of that grab bag is going to connect to it. Like I don't necessarily think that the violence towards Asian Americans was intended as a effort to kill them. It was more a deflection away from Trump's own complicity in the spreading of the pandemic. But it was the same set of tools that you might use to cause violence against another group.
One thing that I might mention too is, in particular, with the spike in violence against Asian Americans during this time, it is overwhelmingly being done by um, other minority groups who were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic,
There
that
is a
were,
very, very complicated set of relationship
yeah,
between racial groups in the United States. Um,
it, and
it's
that's
it's
something too, yeah,
it's an
that
incredibly like there's a very uh it's presented in a certain way how racism is related to in the United States and how bigotry is related to. Um, but there's this very complicated relationship that largely it's a challenging thing. And one of the things I observed, especially early on in the Obama administration, I started to feel like there was this growth in internet rhetoric of white supremacy, which the Southern Poverty Law Center eventually backed up, that there was an increase in joining of militia groups and that, and they said this happens normally during a Democratic presidency in recent history, but now it's happening even more. Um,
yeah,
and you kind of see this culmination of this kind of concept of directed violence in January 6th.
of course, yeah.
So
Um,
I think it's a very, it's kind of like it gets into another thing that my problem with making genocide a legal issue is that people who want to break the law and have resources know exactly what to do the thing without doing the thing.
yeah,
So you get this state where like clearly there are people who are inciting violence, and in this case the Hutu and the Tutsis, there are clearly people who are inciting violence, and there wasn't really any way to stop them because they
there's
control
not
the
any
power
way
of the
to
state.
stop them, because there was a moderate. I don't know if you knew what happened right before the incitement of the gen. Um, they killed, actually. I believe the current president, they shot down the plane. Uh, I really, with the Rwanda genocide, it's interesting. I've studied it, but I wouldn't feel comfortable at the moment teaching a class on it because there are some key figures of it that off the top of my head I don't know. Um, but once this, I gotta find the name of the main figurehead. A good book to read about the Rwanda genocide. It's uh, auto memoirs of Romeo Dallaire. It's called Shake Hands with the Devil. They made a film adaptation, I believe. Um, Romeo Dallaire, he was the head of the UN contingent. I mentioned that earlier, and he basically was all but powerless to. I mean, he was powerless. All but powerless isn't the right word. He was basically powerless and watched this whole thing unfold, and it perfected. I mean, it affected him extremely profoundly. He has dealt with, you know, horrible depression, PTSD, and even suicide
Ideation.
attempts,
Yes.
suicidal ideations from it. Um, but the devil he's referring to in Shake Hands with the Devil is the genocide heir of one of the major leaders of the Hutu government that committed this atrocity. So, Chief Culprit of Rwanda. I gotta figure out his name because he's one of the most evil human beings in history. And it's funny we know Hitler, Pol Pot, Stalin, Mao, but this is a guy that even I struggle remembering his name. Uh, let's see. Uh, hold Bagasora, yeah,
Okay. I can
yeah,
feel
that's
the
his name.
tension. Uh, so
He's the head of the government during this,
let
and
us,
chief culprit.
you go brew some tea. I'm going to go feed the dog because it's that time of night. I'm going to put up the thing and we'll be back in 10 minutes.
Perfect.
Go brew tea.
Yep. Oh,
Why is my thing all the way down here?
we're back.
We are, yes. I had to make some coffee. You silly puppy, get down. No, get down. Go lay
And
down.
I see.
Let's see if any of our audience is retained.
I want to know, particularly, who is the person in our audience who knows of Christian Ungvari, because he has one major book that got him acclaim, abroad outside of Hungary, which is
I'm not sure they're
his,
here this evening. They messaged me beforehand.
yeah. But I would like to know because he's not very popular. Ungvari is not well known outside of Hungary. He made a very, very good book on the Battle of Budapest in the Siege of Budapest. And this is, was translated into English and kind of is what got him, I wouldn't say academic stardom, but, a wider audience in the West. I think he's written a few articles in German, but a lot of his work that applies to my field, like the topic which I wrote about, is in Hungarian. And actually I had to painstakingly sort of translate, not, like through the effort of, some Hungarian scholars at where I went to where I did my master's. I had to get some translations of chapters of his book on the Hanvet in Ukraine.
The individual in question is one of the moderators at President Sunday's Discord, Karasku. I'm going to mess up this name too.
I'm
I'm
guessing
having a day. Karasu Kafka.
Okay. Yeah,
I'm not
it's
entirely
very
certain of their
impressive that he
pronouns,
knows.
actually, off the top of my head.
It's very impressive that this person knows of Ungvari, because he's not very well known, but
They are a very knowledgeable individual, and I'm very glad to have them in our audience when they show up.
I'm actually very surprised at some of the, I'm very pleasantly, like, surprised at, some of how knowledgeable some of these people are.
I pick good.
I'm sure that we have some people probably in our audience that could certainly teach the Rwandan genocide better than I could.
Bosnia.
Bosnia. Should we get to the Srebrenica massacre, particularly the legal,
Thanks,
the
Gal.
controversy legally
I
about
thought
it?
so too, and I don't want to make a mistake in that regard. So I was just going with, I don't know. Go. Sorry, talking to the audience.
Me?
Yes.
So how should I start this? I mean, a little bit of the root.
Yeah, probably. It's been a while, and I think our audience actually kind of skews a little young, so they might not remember.
I have a question for you, because I certainly, even though I was a very young, I remember that the events in former Yugoslavia quite vividly. The Kosovo War the most, because I was 10 years old, and of course there was, on the radio every day a lot, and particularly, when
Microphone
uh,
closer.
we lost several planes, including an F-117. I remember being actually like very upset about that because it was my favorite plane. But I remember the events quite well. Surprisingly well.
This for me happened. This kind of occurs at the same juncture where my mother passes away, so it's one of those points in my mind that gets really fuzzy
Yeah,
in my memory because it's a year after. So kind of
Srebrenica.
the entire case
Yeah,
of the Bosnian Civil War and the NATO intervention
yeah.
is a year. The next year,
She
my mother
passed away
passes
in
away, so it's one of those things
95.
that my mind is very fuzzy on events prior and after that for a lot because it was a particularly time for me. So I don't necessarily remember it in any kind of vivid detail, uh,
Yeah,
as much as I'm
I mean, I
aware of it
don't.
happening.
So The Bosnian War occurs, during as part of, it's part of a series of wars that occur uh, when the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia breaks up. Um, for those who are unfamiliar, sort of the geography and the history of the Balkans, it's a very group of very contentious people, to say the least, the South Slavic peoples, and the conflict that occurred in the 90s is largely a continuation.
You've cut out.
Okay, the conflict which occurred in the night. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
The conflict which occurs in the 90s is really a continuation of the sort of pocket wars which occurred in the Second World War in the same region. So essentially, a continuation conflicts that were occurring between the Serbs, Croats, and Bosnians, the Muslim Bosniaks, or the Muslim group. Largely, it's a continuation of the Ustasha uh, Serb conflict, and when the when Tito dies, I think it was 79 or 80. You have a slow collapse of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. By 1990 or 91, you have Slovenia break off. There's a brief attempt by, the heart of the large majority of the Yugoslav army.
You cut out again.
Oh, God damn. Can you hear me now?
Yes. What are you wearing,
Alrighty.
Jake from State Farm?
All right. It's hard having a cold and then
Yeah, I think it's just the cold is making your microphone have issues. Anyway, Yugoslavia breaks up. The breakup is not amicable.
no, it's not amicable. And because you had a long period of peace, you have, you don't have an even distribution of people living in, certain areas. So in Eastern Croatia, there's a huge Serb minority. In Eastern Bosnia, there's a huge Serb minority. In Southern Bosnia, you have a Croatian minority, so a Catholic minority. And essentially, wars erupt, you know, they erupt sort of over territory. So, the Serbs don't, the heart of, sort of the Federal Republic of
You cut
Serbia,
out again.
the political. How is this happening? Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Do you want me to take a minute and check your connection on your mic on the computer? Make sure it's plugged in properly, not wobbly or something.
Okay, hold on.
Yeah, Zokalix. Now you're gone entirely. I should have a technical difficulties card. Let's make that now too, huh?
Yeah.
Nope, now you're gone again.
Okay.
Hey, I think you're back. Try it again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, it just was loose.
Makes sense.
Okay. So the Serbs at the beginning of this conflict, of the beginning of the Yugoslav civil wars, in the 90s, they have both the Serbian the Serb forces in Croatia and the Bosnian Serb army. Overwhelmingly, they come in possession with the majority of the former Yugoslav, like weapon stocks, tanks, planes, and they have a very advantage over their Croatian and Bosniak counterparts. So that's one thing to mention. Um, and largely, um, it's hard to talk about the Bosnian uh, war without bringing up, the Croatian case and, to a lesser degree, Slovenia ends very quickly. There's a Yugoslav, army force, a Serb army force that's sent there, and they have a whole armored column ambushed and destroyed, and then they give up on Slovenia. Slovenia is very far away. There's no Serbs living there, so they don't really have any interest on holding it. Whereas Croatia, as I said, the eastern part of Croatia has in many areas a Serb majority, or a parity demographically, and the same is the case in eastern Bosnia, near the Drina River. And what ends up happening is you have in Serbia, and then in Bosnia, after Croatia declares independence, Bosnia is going to declare independence as well. And the main government wants a sort of like a plurality government, but the Bosnian Serbs want to remain part of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. This results, of course, in a civil war. And in the buildup to it, you have not Mladic, Karadzic, I believe his name is. So the
Yeah.
president of the Bosnian Serbs in their parliament saying, if the Muslims so the Bosniaks try to um, declare independence, we know that they won't be able to protect themselves. He's alluding here that already he's using genocidal language and alluding to the fact that they're not going to let this happen, and that they're going to try to remove uh, Muslims from the predominantly Serb areas, and that's what ends up happening in a very very bloody campaign that has sort of a military dimension to it. Um, the Should we? I mean, I could talk a little bit about the Drina River massacres, like the
Let's
various towns that
Srebrenica. Did I say that right?
Srebrenica,
Srebrenica. Okay. Uh,
Srebrenica.
let's talk about that one because, as I understand it, that is the kind of central part of this in the legal
That
terms.
occurs in '95, I believe, and that's the area around Srebrenica. It is, I mean, historically, it's a very mixed city. It has I think, equal parts Serb, Bosniak community. It might have even had a Bosniak majority at one. Um, this is an area that is extremely, from about 93 to when the massacre occurs, it's the site of heavy fighting between the Bosniak forces and the the VRS, the Bosnian Serb army. And there are tit for tat killings on both sides. There's a massacre that occurs by that's committed by Bosnian forces under the command of I I don't Sir Orich was a thugs, but during the actual communist Yugoslav regime, a lot of these guys, they get their start on both sides, as enforcers, or like for Tito's government, or the police. But there's a massacre in a village called Kravica, and around several dozen, mostly Serb soldiers, but also civilians are killed. And this isn't the single catalyst, this killing, but it's something that served to be a an one of the straws, I think, the camel's back, even though the camel, in this case the VRS, was committing very similar massacres to Srebrenica at a much smaller scale in other localities. This is a very, very brutal civil war, just to let you know. It's
Yes, that I know.
intimate violence. Um, it's towns basically, like, the Serb part of the town arms itself, and they essentially, drive out with military force the Muslim part of the town. And the sad part about this too is, just like Rwanda, you have many, many mixed couples from the period before. I mean, in Tito's Yugoslavia, you have a period of relative peace between these ethnic groups, and they intermarry with. There's even sort of a Yugoslav identity forming. That's goes beyond the religion. The Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croatians, or Bosniaks, and a lot of the survivors of these wars, Bosniak survivors, I remember in particular whose memoir I was reading. He remembers going to his school, and before the con 1993 or 92, he didn't know his classmates. This classmate was a Serb, or this one was a Muslim. He thought everybody is the same. They didn't. That's how people interacted, and it shows just how much politics can lead to this sort of extreme violence. But and I would say too, religion is, there are like Serbian Orthodox priests who probably encouraged the violence. There are certainly radical Muslims that later on do that. There's a Mujahideen contingent that goes. They didn't find that much public support, but yeah, there's a lot fueling this. But politics is the main driver, and I think that the main reason why this is because the Serbs do not want to let go of these areas. They do not want to concede to a plurality. And actually, at the very beginning of the conflict in '92, there's sort of agreements. There's a discussion between, I believe, Karadzic and Tudjman's government in Croatia about dividing Bosnia between Croat and Serb. So there's conflicts. There's even a sub conflict within the civil war that occurs later. Particularly, there's a town called Mostar, which was, around, half Croat, half Bosniak, and you have a battle that occurs there, shelling between the two forces, and massacres of the predominantly the Bosniak population there, but there's the Croat Defense League that, I think, takes part in that. I think it's called the Croat Defense League. I forget. Recently, there was actually a leader of this group put on trial, and he drank a shot of cyanide. And do you remember this? It happened maybe like about 5 or 6 years ago.
Wasn't that like 17, 18?
Yeah, yeah. He said, I think, like, I just wanted to let it be known that I'm not a criminal. And he takes the shot and he said that was, and then he falls over dead.
You cut out right at the punchline there.
and he said that was poison, and then he falls over dead. Do you hear me?
Yes, now I hear you. Oh, we're
Okay.
having a day today with technical stuff, aren't we? Okay. Uh,
Back to Srebrenica, though. So this is an area highly contested and fought over. And when it's finally when the VRS finally marches in to Srebrenica, you can see it on the faces of the soldiers who had been fighting for that long time. You can see the anger and the hatred in their eyes, and you can tell that they are planning something. Now, where this gets very tricky, and I think I sent you the article, Southwick's article.
yes.
Um, when the Srebrenica massacres occurs, so what it is they decide that this town has been such a problem that the only way to solve the problem of resistance within this area is to kill pretty much all men of fighting age, men and boys.
You've cut out
They
again.
make a deliberate point of transport the children and the elderly out, and then they systematically arrest and murder the male Bosniak population of the district at various killing sites throughout Srebrenica and the surrounding villages. Around 8,000 men and boys are killed. And you have to understand that this is happening in Europe, and it's the first massacre. And really, even since then, even with events that we're seeing in Ukraine, nothing has approached that scale since the Second World War. This and their images are coming out of several of the Serb run camps for Bosnian men, particularly prisoners of war. And you see these men completely dilapidated and starved to death. Images of the Holocaust are once again, in the minds of the European conscious, of the European public. And this particular massacre, it happens under the watch of the UN once again. The Dutch contingent there was very much powerless to do anything. And also, there was an incident which occurred where they don't really know who threw the grenade, but it's believed to have been, one of the Bosnian either civilians or someone within the town threw a grenade, which ended up killing 2 Dutch soldiers. And so there were a lot of them were very, you have this military force that comes and occupies the town and basically holding the people hostage, holding your men hostage, and they really, they themselves can't do a whole lot. There's an argument, that there could have been an intervention right at this time. I think that it certainly was possible. Right afterward, you have an intervention where NATO intervenes against the Bosnian Serb army, and just in a very short bombing campaign, forces them to capitulate. So, this could have been prevented. But where you get into the so how did a genocide conviction happen out of this incident? So, because it was so unprecedented, they decided to sort of narrow the geographic area in which genocide occurred. And their argument was that killing the Bosnian men and boys of Srebrenica it fit Article B is, to commit bodily harm against members
Bodily or
and to
mental
kill
harm.
in whole or in part, to kill in part. And that's how they came to this decision. The issue is, though, is from a military standpoint, although it is overkill, you see similar, actually, like harkening back to the Hungarian army in Ukraine. There was a Hungarian rear area general who was complaining to the Heer, the command, the German rear area, you know, partisan resistance was so bad in their area of control, wanted to execute all men and boys in the area from 19 to 55. And actually, that was a time where the Wehrmacht showed restraint and said, no, you're not going to do that because that's going to create us a lot. We need these people to work for us. We need them. So, that was actually an incident where the Wehrmacht did show restraint. But here, of course, the motivation is largely the area was extremely contested. And the logic, I believe, was a military and foremost, in a very twisted way of conducting.
It's not a very good. It's not a militarily sound strategy.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
at all. Uh, I'm deciding what to do here. Hang on.
I want to hear your opinion though on this event and this military decision. Um,
Well,
there is without a shadow of a doubt that this incident gravely affected the Muslim population. It has never, mainly because actually a lot of these areas in the east are now have a Serb majority, and actually the war ended bittersweet. There wasn't
you're still cutting out.
ended up with a
Cutting up.
divided country.
Yeah, you're cutting out a lot.
Okay.
So here's what we're gonna
Uh,
do. I will do that, and then we'll kind of wrap this up because the technical difficulties are just mounting this evening, and I don't want you to kill your voice before you have to go to work tomorrow. So
can we continue this though? I really would like to
yes, we
because
will reschedule around something in February, but I don't want
okay,
to. I don't want to murder you before you have to go speak with people all day for 4 days a week.
yeah,
Trust me, I've done that job. It doesn't work out well. Anyway,
yeah,
so I mean, when we were doing the classroom instruction way back in the day when I was still, a wee lad, for civilians on the battlefield training, the captain who was teaching the course got up and asked us around, like, why do we care about this issue? Why do we care about uh, civilians in battle spaces? And the answer really comes down to the fact that if you don't care about civilians in the battle space, if you don't take steps to isolate them from the conflict, they become the enemy.
yeah.
You are not going to be getting into a case where uh, you can kill your way out of a problem like that. And
Of course,
it's not a sound military decision. This area is I'm experiencing heavy resistance in. Okay, do I need this area? Not really from any tactical standpoint or strategic standpoint. I want it because I want to
it,
kill the people in it is not a sound plan.
it is less about though practically speaking here as it is. There's the military component.
You're cutting out again.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, just hold the microphone. Singer
Yeah, I'm
style.
just gonna hold it. Yeah. So there's the issue. So this isn't just a military decision. You have to remember that this is part of a strategy to push, to homogenize ethnically this area. Um, and they have what I have argued. I did a study of Srebrenica. Very actually, it was done very early in my career, and I would like to do one again with a much better data set. But essentially, it is part of a strategy to homogenize this area. But they are leaving, the option of fleeing there. They do commit horrible violence,
But
but
it's
they still
not.
leave that as an option.
But that's not
And
separate from any military consideration. That's not a sound option for people. Uh,
of course it's not.
it's
But
not like
certain, I mean, each every military has its own sort of strategy in terms of dealing with, civilians and dealing with irregular combatants. Uh, German treatment of irregulars was notoriously harsh even before the time of the Wehrmacht, even before, the Second World War. This is a sort of their harsh, strategy of, guerrilla warfare has roots, that goes all the way back really even to I think the 30 Years War, in their culture.
that or the
Um,
Teutoburg Forest, really, arguably.
yeah, possibly, but I mean, essentially, like this strategy, the reason why they committed these killings, it was brought up in the Christich trial, the trial of Christich, uh, one of the generals of the VRS. Essentially, that the leaders of the VRS couldn't have failed to know. It might not have been the plan to wipe out the people of, to wipe out the Bosniak population of Srebrenica, but they couldn't have failed to know that killing that many men would have a irreversible and grievous effect on the Bosniak population of Srebrenica as a whole. And you see how I'm mentioning the locality here,
Yes.
because they very much, in order to get this conviction, limited the geographic scope. Now, other such mass violence was occurring, but this is by far the largest during this conflict, and it's still, as I said before, it remains the largest massacre to occur on European soil since the Second World War. Um, I will even be honest, I study a lot of similar massacres that occurred in Ukraine during the Second World War. And this is, in terms of scale, it's right up there with, some of the bigger ones.
Yes.
So you can see how shocking it was at the time. But the argument that Southwick makes is, should, given that we have set aside the word genocide and the crime of it legally as being there, for the worst of the worst crimes, should we limit it? And, you and I are talking about how the problem with it is it's too limiting, the legal criteria for it. It's too limiting.
Yeah, I wasn't a big fan of that
I mean,
Southwick paper. I'll be perfectly honest, but
you were a big fan or
I
not a
was not a
big fan?
big fan of it.
I mean, she brings up some valid arguments, but overall, yeah. Um, and it's like what I said before. When you have something that heinous and that terrible that happens, and it brings to mind genocide. It just that sort of event, but you know, it doesn't always fit. It doesn't live up to the actual definition, though it is genocide. It legally was, ruled as such. On our next episode, when we continue this, we're going to talk about Cambodia,
Yay. Uh,
but this is something particularly important because that is also an extremely, probably one of the most horrendous events in human history. And for the vast majority of its victims, it's not genocide. It's only genocide for a certain portion of that group.
Okay, we're stopping here
So
before you collapse into a pile of cold.
yeah, thanks.
So here, okay. So we will reschedule the redux of this night to be, I guess. At any rate, next month's show, if you want to follow along, we will talk about movies and their role because we've been having a lot of heavy discussions lately, haven't we? Let's talk about movies and the
We will
role in getting
continue
people.
this heavy discussion.
Yes, I'm getting there. We talk about movies and their role in getting people interested in history, and we'll be talking about the movie Midway by Roland Emmerich, which will give me an excellent opportunity to wax poetic about military history for a night.
God, I have to watch a Roland Emmerich movie, really?
You do.
I mean, we could just watch Independence Day. I mean,
No, we can't. Not again. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming out tonight.
take care, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Just bad timing with my cold.
Yep.
So